The most dangerous criminal in the modern world was not a man hiding in dark alleys, nor someone leading gangs in the streets, but a quiet programmer sitting behind a glowing computer screen, writing lines of code that would silently reshape reality itself, building a hidden empire so vast and so secretive that even governments struggled to understand its true size. And at the center of it all was a man named Paul Roux, a figure whose life blurred the line between genius and criminal mastermind, between legitimate entrepreneur and shadow ruler of a global network that operated across continents, hidden beneath layers of encryption, digital infrastructure, and carefully constructed illusions that made him appear to be nothing more than a successful software developer, while in truth, he was orchestrating one of the most unusual and technologically sophisticated criminal operations in modern history, proving that in the digital age, power no longer belonged only to those with weapons, armies, or political influence, but to those who understood systems, information, and the invisible architecture that connected the world. And Paul Roux understood those systems better than almost anyone else, beginning his journey not as a criminal, but as a brilliant and intensely focused programmer. A man fascinated by logic, security, and the ability to control information with absolute precision. Growing up with an exceptional aptitude for mathematics and computing, he immersed himself deeply in the technical world, where every problem had a solution and every system could be understood, modified, and controlled. And as computers became more powerful, and the internet began connecting people across vast distances, Roux recognized something that most people did not yet see: that software was not just a tool, but a gateway to influence, privacy, and power. And this realization drove him to develop skills that would later become the foundation of his hidden empire, mastering encryption, secure communications, and advanced programming techniques that allowed information to be concealed, protected, and transmitted without detection, skills that were highly valuable in legitimate industries, but also incredibly useful for anyone who wanted to operate outside the reach of authorities. And at first, Roux appeared to follow a conventional path, building legitimate software products and presenting himself as a professional entrepreneur, creating encryption software that was respected in technical communities, gaining a reputation as a talented developer, capable of creating secure systems that protected users' data. And this public image allowed him to move freely in business environments, earning trust and establishing connections that would later serve a much darker purpose. Because behind the scenes, he was not just building software, he was building infrastructure, systems designed not only for security but for secrecy, systems that could allow someone to operate anonymously across multiple countries, coordinating complex operations without leaving obvious traces. And as his technical expertise grew, so did his ambition, and slowly, almost invisibly, the line between legitimate entrepreneurship and criminal activity began to fade, replaced by a hybrid existence where technology was used not only for business, but as a shield, a weapon, and a tool for control, allowing Roux to create layers of protection around himself, ensuring that even those working within his network often did not fully understand who he was or how much power he truly held. And this separation, this distance between the man and the operations, became one of his greatest strengths because it allowed him to remain invisible, operating through intermediaries, encrypted communications, and digital systems that masked his identity and location, turning him into a ghost within the very networks he had created. And while traditional crime relied on physical presence, intimidation, and visible authority, Roux's model was different. It relied on information, structure, and absolute control over communication, ensuring that every part of his network functioned efficiently while keeping him safely hidden from view. And this approach reflected his mindset as a programmer, someone who saw the world as a system to be optimized, controlled, and manipulated, where every variable could be managed and every risk minimized through careful planning and technological precision. And this mindset allowed him to expand his operations across borders, taking advantage of differences in laws, jurisdictions, and enforcement capabilities, creating a network that was not confined to any single country, but instead existed everywhere and nowhere at the same time, connected through encrypted channels and digital coordination, and as the internet continued to grow, providing new opportunities and new vulnerabilities, Roux adapted quickly, using his knowledge to stay ahead of those who might try to track or stop him, constantly evolving his systems, strengthening his security, and ensuring that his empire remained hidden beneath layers of complexity that few people could fully understand. And this combination of intelligence, technical expertise, and strategic thinking made him uniquely dangerous, not because he relied on violence alone, but because he understood how to build systems that could operate independently, systems that could continue functioning even if individual parts were removed, systems that mirrored the resilience and flexibility of the digital networks he knew so well, and as his operations expanded, he maintained the outward appearance of a legitimate businessman, managing software companies, interacting with partners, and presenting himself as a professional entrepreneur, carefully maintaining this dual identity to ensure that suspicion would never fall directly on him. And this duality became a defining feature of his life. The coexistence of two separate realities, one visible and respectable, the other hidden and powerful, and this ability to exist in both worlds simultaneously required constant vigilance, constant control, and constant adaptation, because any mistake, any weakness, could expose everything he had built, and yet for years he managed to avoid detection, continuing to expand his influence, refine his systems, and strengthen his network, proving that in the modern era, the most powerful empires were not always built in the open, but in the shadows, constructed not from physical territory, but from information, secrecy, and the invisible connections that linked the world together. And Paul Roux stood at the center of this invisible empire, a programmer who had transformed his knowledge into something far greater than software, something that gave him influence across continents, something that allowed him to operate beyond traditional boundaries, and something that demonstrated a new kind of power, one defined not by physical presence, but by control over systems, communication, and information itself. And as he continued to refine his methods, he became more confident, more ambitious, and more deeply embedded in the secret world he had created, trusting his technology, trusting his systems, and trusting his ability to remain hidden, believing that as long as he controlled the infrastructure, he controlled the outcome. And for a time, that belief appeared to be true. As his network continued to grow, his influence continued to expand, and his identity remained concealed behind layers of encryption, distance, and carefully constructed illusions that made him appear ordinary while hiding the extraordinary reality of who he had become. A man whose greatest weapon was not force, but knowledge, and whose greatest defense was not walls, but code, silently shaping a hidden empire in the digital age. As his confidence grew, Paul Roux began to move beyond the role of a skilled programmer and into something far more complex, a central architect of systems that allowed him to extend his reach into the real world while remaining protected by layers of digital abstraction, transforming technology into a command structure that could operate across time zones, languages, and national borders. And unlike traditional leaders who needed to be physically present to maintain control, Roux designed his network so that presence itself became unnecessary, replacing face-to-face interaction with encrypted messages, digital instructions, and carefully managed chains of communication that ensured loyalty and efficiency while preserving his anonymity. And this approach reflected a fundamental shift in how power could be exercised in the modern era, no longer tied to geography or visibility, but instead flowing through invisible channels that connected individuals to a central authority they might never see or fully understand. And Roux's mastery of encryption became one of the key pillars of this system, allowing him to communicate securely with associates across multiple countries, ensuring that even if messages were intercepted, they would reveal nothing meaningful without the proper keys, turning communication itself into a locked container that only he and his trusted inner circle could open. And this level of security gave him a profound advantage because it allowed him to coordinate complex operations with confidence, knowing that his instructions could not easily be traced back to him. And beyond encryption, he he also applied his programming mindset to organizational structure, breaking down operations into modular components, each managed independently, each isolated from the others, so that no single person could see the entire picture, reducing the risk that anyone could expose the full scope of his activities. And this compartmentalization mirrored the way software systems are designed, with individual modules performing specific functions, while the overall system remains controlled by a central authority. And through this design, Roux became not just a participant, but the operating system of his own empire, directing actions from behind the scenes while remaining hidden from direct exposure. And his legitimate businesses played a crucial role in maintaining this illusion, serving as fronts that provided a believable explanation for his wealth, his international connections, and his constant movement between locations, allowing him to present himself as nothing more than a successful entrepreneur managing global software operations, while beneath the surface, those same businesses provided infrastructure, communication channels, and logistical support that enabled his secret network to function smoothly. And this blending of legitimate and illegitimate activity created a protective layer of plausibility, making it difficult for outsiders to distinguish between what was real and what was concealed. And over time, this strategy allowed him to expand his reach even further, building a network that extended into multiple regions, each connected through digital systems that he controlled. And his technical expertise allowed him to monitor operations, track progress, and enforce discipline with precision, using data and communication logs to maintain oversight without needing physical presence. And this constant flow of information gave him a level of situational awareness that traditional leaders could never achieve, allowing him to anticipate problems, respond quickly to challenges, and maintain control over a network that spanned vast distances. And yet, despite this immense complexity, his systems remained remarkably efficient because they were designed with the same logic and structure that governed the software he had spent years mastering, optimized for reliability, security, and control, and this efficiency reinforced his confidence, convincing him that his empire was not only powerful, but sustainable, capable of enduring indefinitely as long as he maintained control over the digital infrastructure that connected it all. And this belief was strengthened by the fact that for years, he remained beyond the reach of authorities, his identity hidden behind layers of encryption and misdirection, his operations concealed within legitimate-looking business activities, and his communication protected by technologies that few investigators fully understood. And during this time, he continued to refine his methods, improving his systems, strengthening his security, and ensuring that his network remained resilient against potential threats, constantly adapting to changes in technology and law enforcement capabilities, staying one step ahead through innovation and careful planning. And this constant evolution became one of his defining characteristics, a relentless drive to improve, optimize, and secure every aspect of his operations, treating his empire not as a static organization, but as a living system that required continuous maintenance and adaptation. And this approach allowed him to maintain control even as the world around him changed, as technology advanced and global connectivity increased, creating new opportunities and new risks that he navigated with the precision of a programmer debugging a complex system. And this mindset extended to his leadership style, where he relied on logic, structure, and control rather than emotional connection, viewing people as components within a larger system, each with a defined role and purpose, each contributing to the overall function of the network. And this perspective allowed him to make decisions with cold efficiency, prioritizing stability and security above all else, ensuring that his empire remained intact and functional. And as his influence grew, so did the scale of his operations, expanding into new areas, new regions, and new opportunities, all coordinated through the digital systems he had created. And this expansion reinforced the illusion that his empire was unstoppable, protected by technology, distance, and secrecy. And for a time, it seemed as though he had achieved something unprecedented, a global network controlled not through physical dominance, but through information, encryption, and digital infrastructure, demonstrating the immense power that could be wielded by someone who understood the hidden architecture of the modern world. And yet beneath this apparent invulnerability, small vulnerabilities began to emerge, subtle traces left behind by the very systems that had protected him for so long. Because no matter how secure a system may appear, it must still interact with the real world, and those interactions inevitably create patterns, data, and connections that can be observed, analyzed, and eventually understood by those determined enough to look. And although Roux had built his empire with extraordinary care, he could not completely eliminate these traces, and over time, those traces would begin to form a path, a digital trail that would slowly lead investigators closer to the truth, even as he continued to operate with confidence, believing that his knowledge, his systems, and his control were sufficient to protect him. And this belief, rooted in years of success and secrecy, would ultimately be tested in ways he could not fully anticipate, as the same interconnected world that had enabled his rise would also create the conditions for his exposure, proving that in a system defined by connection, isolation is never absolute, and secrecy, no matter how carefully constructed, can never be completely permanent. Traditional boundaries, and something that demonstrated a new kind of power, one defined not by physical presence, but by control over systems, communication, and information itself. And as he continued to refine his methods, he became more confident, more ambitious, and more deeply embedded in the secret world he had created, trusting his technology, trusting his systems, and trusting his ability to remain hidden, believing that as long as he controlled the infrastructure, he controlled the outcome. And for a time, that belief appeared to be true. As his network continued to grow, his influence continued to expand, and his identity remained concealed behind layers of encryption, distance, and carefully constructed illusions that made him appear ordinary while hiding the extraordinary reality of who he had become. A man whose greatest weapon was not force, but knowledge, and whose greatest defense was not walls, but code, silently shaping a hidden empire in the digital age. For years, Paul Roux existed as a shadow within the global system, protected by encryption, distance, and the carefully engineered complexity of his own creation. But the very nature of digital systems ensured that nothing could remain perfectly invisible forever, because every message sent, every instruction delivered, and every transaction completed left behind fragments of information, tiny echoes that accumulated silently over time. And while any single fragment appeared meaningless on its own, together they formed patterns, and patterns could be studied, interpreted, and ultimately understood by those with the patience and resources to follow them. And somewhere within law enforcement and intelligence communities, investigators began to notice anomalies, small irregularities that hinted at a larger structure hidden beneath the surface. And at first, these anomalies did not reveal a name or a face, but they revealed something else, the presence of a system that was unusually disciplined, unusually secure, and unusually resistant to conventional investigative methods. And this alone was enough to draw attention, because systems do not create themselves. They are built by individuals, and individuals, no matter how careful, exist within reality, and reality always leaves traces. And so the process began, slowly, methodically, and patiently, as investigators analyzed data, examined communication patterns, and coordinated efforts across borders, recognizing that they were not dealing with a conventional organization, but with something far more sophisticated, something designed by someone who understood both technology and human behavior at an exceptional level. And this realization changed the nature of the investigation, forcing authorities to adapt, to think like engineers rather than traditional investigators, to examine infrastructure rather than individuals, to follow the architecture of the network rather than the visible actions of those within it. And as they did, they began to uncover connections, links between digital identities, business entities, and communication systems that pointed toward a central authority, someone who was not visible, but whose presence could be inferred through the consistency, structure, and control embedded within the network itself. And this process was not fast, and it was not easy, because the very systems that Roux had built were designed to resist exactly this kind of analysis, designed to conceal identity, obscure location, and prevent attribution. And yet over time, the accumulation of evidence began to narrow the possibilities, gradually transforming uncertainty into suspicion and suspicion into focus, as investigators worked to uncover the human presence behind the digital facade. And during this time, Roux continued to operate, confident in his systems, confident in his ability to remain hidden, believing that his encryption, his compartmentalization, and his technological expertise were sufficient to protect him indefinitely, and this confidence had been reinforced by years of success, years without exposure, years in which his empire had grown and functioned exactly as he intended. And yet the world was changing. Technology was advancing, investigative techniques were evolving, and global cooperation between authorities was becoming more effective, creating new capabilities that had not existed when he first built his network. And these changes slowly shifted the balance, reducing the advantage that secrecy and encryption had once provided, and increasing the ability of investigators to analyze complex systems and uncover hidden relationships. And eventually, the invisible walls that had protected him began to weaken. Not through a single catastrophic failure, but through the gradual accumulation of insight as investigators pieced together fragments of information, building a clearer and clearer picture of the man behind the empire. And as this picture emerged, the investigation entered a new phase, one focused not just on understanding the network, but on identifying and locating its creator. And this required patience, coordination, and precision, because any premature action could alert him, giving him the opportunity to disappear behind new layers of encryption and misdirection. And so authorities moved carefully, monitoring, analyzing, and waiting for the moment when certainty would replace suspicion. And when that moment finally arrived, it represented the culmination of years of effort, years of analysis, and years of determination to uncover the truth behind one of the most unusual and sophisticated criminal networks ever encountered. And the exposure of Paul Roux marked not only the end of his hidden anonymity, but also the beginning of a broader realization about the nature of power in the digital age, a realization that technology itself is neutral, neither good nor evil, but capable of amplifying the intentions of those who wield it, capable of enabling both innovation and deception, capable of connecting the world while also providing new ways to conceal identity and control information. And Roux' story became a powerful example of this duality, illustrating how intelligence, skill, and technical knowledge can be used to build extraordinary systems, but also how those systems remain vulnerable to the fundamental truth that nothing exists in complete isolation, that every system interacts with the world, and that those interactions create traces that can eventually be followed. And as investigators dismantled the network he had created, they revealed not just the operations themselves, but the underlying architecture, the structure that had allowed one individual to exert influence across continents while remaining hidden behind a digital curtain. And this revelation carried important lessons not only for law enforcement but for society as a whole, highlighting the growing importance of cybersecurity, digital awareness, and the need to understand the systems that shape modern life. Because as technology continues to evolve, the line between physical and digital reality becomes increasingly blurred, creating new opportunities and new risks that must be navigated carefully. And Paul Roux' rise and fall demonstrated both the power and the limitations of technological control, showing that while code can conceal identity and encryption can protect communication, they cannot eliminate the reality that every action exists within a larger system, and that systems, no matter how complex, can be understood by those willing to study them long enough. And in the end, his story became more than just the story of one man. It became a reflection of the digital era itself, an era defined by connection, information, and the invisible infrastructure that shapes the modern world, an era in which power can be exercised silently, from behind screens, through systems that few people fully understand, and an era in which the balance between secrecy and transparency continues to evolve, shaped by the ongoing interaction between those who seek to conceal and those who seek to uncover. And Paul Roux, the programmer who built a secret crime empire, became one of the most striking examples of this hidden struggle. A reminder that the greatest revolutions are not always visible, that the most powerful empires are not always built in plain sight, and that in the digital age, the ability to control information, can be as powerful as any traditional form of authority, but also that no system, no matter how carefully designed, can remain hidden forever, because every system exists within reality, and reality, eventually, reveals the truth, leaving behind a legacy that serves as both a warning and a lesson for the future. A story that continues to captivate not because of its scale alone, but because of what it reveals about the world we live in, a world where code can shape destiny, where secrecy can create empires, and where even the most invisible figures can one day be brought into the light, reminding us that knowledge is power, but accountability is inevitable, and that the digital shadows, no matter how deep, can never fully escape the reach of time, persistence, and truth. And if you are benefiting from our topics, please subscribe, like, and turn on the bell notification so you can see our new videos early.